The world watched with bated breath as former President Donald Trump attempted to broker a ceasefire in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. His proposal, calling for a 30-day pause in hostilities, was met with a resounding no from Russian President Vladimir Putin. This rejection, confirmed by sources close to the Kremlin, has dealt a significant blow to hopes for a swift end to the devastating war. The conflict, now in its third year, continues to inflict unimaginable suffering upon the Ukrainian people and threatens to destabilize the entire European continent. The international community condemned Putin's intransigence, with many world leaders expressing their deep disappointment. President Biden, in a strongly worded statement, called on Putin to reconsider his position and prioritize the lives of innocent civilians. The European Union, meanwhile, announced plans to impose additional sanctions on Russia, targeting key sectors of its economy. Despite the mounting pressure, the Kremlin remains defiant, insisting that Russia will not bow to Western demands. The failure of Trump's ceasefire initiative raises serious questions about the future of Ukraine. With no end to the fighting in sight, the country faces a humanitarian crisis of unprecedented proportions. Millions have been displaced from their homes, seeking refuge in neighboring countries. The Ukrainian economy lies in ruins, its infrastructure shattered by relentless Russian bombardment. As the conflict drags on, the human cost continues to climb, casting a long shadow over the region's future. The international community must now grapple with the difficult question of what comes next. With diplomatic efforts seemingly at a standstill, the possibility of a protracted conflict looms large. The world watches, holding its breath, hoping for a flicker of hope in the darkness, but for now, the silence speaks volumes and it whispers a chilling message. Peace remains a distant dream. While a ceasefire might offer temporary respite from the bloodshed, it does little to address the underlying issues driving the conflict. Russia, it seems, is playing a longer game. Putin's objective is not merely to secure a temporary cessation of hostilities, but to negotiate a comprehensive peace settlement that advances Russia's strategic interests. This settlement, as envisioned by the Kremlin, would likely involve significant concessions from Ukraine, including territorial concessions and limitations on its sovereignty. At the heart of Russia's demands is the recognition of Crimea, annexed by Russia in 2014 as Russian territory. Moscow also seeks to maintain its influence over the eastern Donbas region, where Russian-backed separatists have been fighting Ukrainian forces since 2014. Furthermore, Russia demands guarantees that Ukraine will never join NATO, viewing the Western military alliance as an existential threat. These demands, deemed non-starters by Ukraine and its Western allies, have become major obstacles in the ongoing negotiations. Putin's calculus is clear. He believes that time is on his side. The longer the conflict drags on, the more pressure will mount on Ukraine and its Western backers to make concessions. Russia's vast resources, both military and economic, allow it to sustain a protracted conflict, while the West's resolve may waver as the costs of supporting Ukraine continue to rise. Putin is betting that by remaining steadfast in his demands, he can eventually force the West to accept a negotiated settlement that favors Russia. This strategy, however, carries significant risks. The longer the conflict continues, the greater the likelihood of escalation. A miscalculation, an accident, or a deliberate provocation could quickly spiral into a wider war, one that could draw in NATO and potentially escalate into a nuclear confrontation. The stakes are incredibly high, and the world watches nervously as Putin gambles on the future of Europe. Trump's foray into international diplomacy, while well-intentioned, has once again exposed his weakness for authoritarian strongmen. His willingness to engage with Putin, even as Russian bombs rain down on Ukrainian cities, has been met with criticism from both sides of the aisle. Critics argue that Trump's eagerness to strike a deal, coupled with his past praise for Putin, undermines America's credibility on the world stage and emboldens autocrats around the globe. Trump's approach to the conflict has been characterized by a series of concessions and mixed messages. He has repeatedly downplayed Russia's aggression, even suggesting that Putin's actions were justified. He has also wavered on providing Ukraine with the military aid it needs to defend itself, fearing that such assistance could escalate the conflict. This inconsistent approach has left Ukraine and its allies uncertain about the United States' commitment to its defense. The former president's supporters, however, argue that his willingness to engage with Putin is a sign of strength, not weakness. They contend that only through direct dialogue can the United States hope to find a peaceful resolution to the conflict. They also point to Trump's record of imposing tough sanctions on Russia, arguing that he's not afraid to stand up to Putin when necessary. Trump's decision to insert himself into the Ukraine crisis has undoubtedly complicated an already complex situation. His unpredictable behavior and penchant for making pronouncements without consulting with allies have left the international community scrambling to react. Whether his involvement will ultimately help or hinder efforts to find a peaceful resolution remains to be seen. As the war in Ukraine grinds on, the world watches with a mixture of horror and helplessness. The conflict has already claimed tens of thousands of lives, displaced millions, and shattered the fragile peace that had prevailed in Europe since the end of the Cold War. The outcome of this conflict will have profound implications, not just for Ukraine and Russia, but for the entire international order. The most immediate priority is to alleviate the suffering of the Ukrainian people. The humanitarian crisis unfolding in Ukraine is among the worst in recent memory, and the international community must do everything in its power to provide assistance to those in need. This includes providing food, water, shelter, and medical care to the millions who have been displaced from their homes. It also means holding Russia accountable for its actions and ensuring that those responsible for war crimes are brought to justice. Beyond the immediate humanitarian crisis, the world must grapple with the long-term implications of the conflict. The war in Ukraine has exposed the fragility of the international order and the inadequacy of existing mechanisms for preventing and resolving conflict. It has also highlighted the dangers of unchecked aggression and the importance of collective security. The world that emerges from this conflict will be a different place. The rules-based order that has governed international relations for decades is under strain, and the future of global security is uncertain. What is clear, however, is that the stakes are higher than ever. The world cannot afford to let the conflict in Ukraine escalate into a wider war. The future of humanity may very well depend on our ability to find a peaceful resolution to this crisis.